There are places in this world that do not simply exist on a map. They exist inside the human soul long before a person ever sets foot on their sacred ground. Jerusalem is one of those places, and within Jerusalem, standing silent and eternal against the weight of centuries, is a wall. Not just any wall, a wall that has absorbed the prayers, the tears, the whispers, and the deepest longings of millions of human hearts across thousands of years. This is the story of a journey taken by ordinary people carrying extraordinary faith, a journey that would change each of them forever. The morning was like any other morning in thousands of cities across the world. Alarm clock sounded, coffee was brewed, bags were zipped shut one final time. But for a small group of Christians preparing to board a plane headed for Tel Aviv, this was no ordinary morning. This was the morning their lives would begin to shift in ways they could not yet imagine or put into words. Pastor David had been a man of faith for more than 3 decades. He had stood behind pulpits in small towns and in crowded city churches. He had read the scriptures aloud to congregations of 50 and congregations of 500. He had prayed over the sick and the grieving and the lost. He had spoken the name of Jerusalem more times than he could count. And yet, he had never been there. Not once in all his years of ministry had he ever walked the streets that Jesus walked, touched the stones that generations of faithful hands had touched, or stood before the wall that stood at the very heart of the ancient city of God. Today, that was about to change. Sarah was 28 years old and she had questions, big questions. The kind that kept a person awake at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling wondering whether any of it was real. She had grown up in the church. She knew the stories by heart. She could recite the verses. But somewhere along the way, the fire had cooled. The certainty had softened into something more like hope with a question mark attached to it. She had signed up for this pilgrimage on something close to impulse, telling herself that if God was real and if Jerusalem was real and if the faith she had been handed as a child was real, then surely going there would either confirm it or settle the matter once and for all. Thomas had almost not come. He had booked the trip and canceled it twice. He had sat with his credit card in his hand on 3 separate evenings before finally clicking confirm and shutting his laptop before he could change his mind again. Thomas was not sure he believed anymore. He was not sure he had ever truly believed in the way the people around him seemed to believe. He wore a small silver cross around his neck, a gift from his grandmother, but it felt more like a memory than a declaration. He came because something inside him, some quiet and stubborn ember that refused to go completely dark, told him to come. Mary had been waiting for this trip for 47 years. She had clipped a photograph of the Western Wall from a magazine in 1978 and pinned it above her kitchen sink. She had looked at that photograph every single morning while washing dishes and praying and raising her children and burying her husband and growing old. She had always believed she would get there one day. And now at 72, with knees that ached and eyes that needed stronger glasses every year, she was finally on her way. She clutched her rosary in her lap on the flight and she did not sleep and she did not want to. The plane descended through thin clouds and the land of Israel appeared below like something out of a dream half remembered from a childhood Sunday school lesson. The coastal strip of Tel Aviv shimmered in the Mediterranean light. The hills rose gently inland, ancient and patient, and somewhere beyond those hills, invisible from the air but felt somehow, Jerusalem waited. When Pastor David stepped off the plane and placed both feet on Israeli soil for the first time, he stopped. The line of passengers behind him flowed around him like a river around a stone. He stood still for just a moment. His eyes were wide. His lips were pressed together in the way a person presses their lips when emotion threatens to overtake them. He had read about this moment in the journals and memoirs of other pilgrims. He had told others about it from behind his pulpit, and now it was happening to him. And it was nothing like he had imagined, and it was everything like he had imagined all at once. Sarah walked through the airport terminal with her phone in her hand and a map of Jerusalem on the screen. She had planned the trip meticulously. She had a list of every site she wanted to visit, every street she wanted to walk, every prayer she intended to say. But already stepping into the warm Israeli air that drifted through the terminal doors, she felt the neat edges of her plan beginning to soften. Jerusalem was not a place that could be approached with a checklist. She would learn this soon enough. Thomas sat down on a bench inside the terminal and watched the other pilgrims round him buzzing with excitement. He observed them the way a person outside a warm-lit window observes a party they are not sure they were meant to attend. Pastor David was organizing everyone with quiet authority. Mary was already dabbing at her eyes with a small handkerchief. Sarah was typing notes into her phone. Thomas folded his arms and looked at the floor and told himself he was fine. He was here. That was enough for now. The drive from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem took less than an hour, but it felt like a passage through time itself. The highway climbed into the Judean hills, winding through ancient terrace slopes where olive trees grew in twisted silver formations that had stood for centuries. The landscape was unlike anything the pilgrims had seen before. It was spare and stony and yet somehow deeply alive, as though the land itself was aware of its own significance. Pastor David sat at the front of the van with his Bible open in his lap, not reading, just resting his hand on the pages, feeling the familiar texture of the paper beneath his fingers, and then the city appeared. Jerusalem rose on the hill ahead of them like something that had always existed and always would. The ancient walls caught the afternoon light and turned gold. The dome of the rock glinted above the rooftops like a jewel set into the crown of the city. Everyone in the van fell silent at the same moment without any agreement or signal. Even Thomas crossed his arms and leaned forward slightly in his seat. No one spoke. There was nothing adequate to say. The van passed through the Jaffa Gate and entered the old city, and the modern world fell away like a coat slipped from the shoulders. The streets narrowed to corridors of ancient limestone. The stones underfoot were worn smooth by the passing of more feet than any human mind could calculate. Feet belonging to Romans and crusaders and pilgrims and merchants and prophets and kings. The air smelled of incense and spices and the particular dry warmth that belongs to old stone and afternoon sun. Pastor David led the group through the winding streets with a kind of reverence in his step. He pointed out landmarks with a voice slightly lower than his usual speaking voice, as though he was instinctively aware that in this place, the ordinary volume of everyday speech felt somehow too loud. Sarah walked close behind him with her notebook pressed to her chest. Thomas brought up the rear, hands in the pockets of his jeans, looking up at the buildings on either side with an expression that was slowly, incrementally, losing its guardedness. They came to the Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrows, the path that tradition holds as the route Jesus walked on the day of his crucifixion, carrying the cross through these same narrow streets toward Golgotha. The stones of the Via Dolorosa were ancient beneath their feet, worn and polished by 2,000 years of pilgrim footsteps. Small metal plaques marked the stations along the way, and at each one, Pastor David paused and read aloud from his Bible in a quiet, steady voice while the group stood close together and listened. Sarah stopped at one of the stations and placed her hand flat against the stone wall. The stone was cool and slightly rough beneath her palm. She closed her eyes. She was not sure what she expected to feel. She was not sure she expected to feel anything at all. But there was something there, something quiet and difficult to name, a presence, perhaps, or simply the weight of all the human longing that had passed through this narrow corridor for so many centuries before her. She opened her eyes and looked at her own hand on the ancient stone, and something inside her shifted very slightly, like a key turning in a lock that has been stiff for a long time. Thomas stood apart from the group at one of the stations and watched the others touch the wall and bow their heads. He watched with the careful attention of someone who is trying to understand something that exists just beyond the edge of their comprehension. He did not reach out to touch the wall himself, not yet, but he watched, and something in the watching began to work on him in ways he would not recognize until later. Mary moved slowly along the Via Dolorosa, her pace hurried and deliberate. At each station she paused for a long moment, her lips moving silently, her rosary beads moving through her fingers with the practiced ease of decades. She had prayed these stations of the cross every Good Friday for more than 50 years in the small parish church back home. She had prayed them in her kitchen and in her car and in the hospital chapel when her husband was dying. But to pray them here, on the actual stones, in the actual narrow corridor of the actual city, was something that lay entirely beyond the reach of words. They turned a corner and the streets opened in the western wall plaza, spread before them, and the wall itself rose against the sky, and everything stopped. It is difficult to explain what a person feels when they first see the western wall. Photographs do not prepare you for it. Descriptions do not prepare you for it. Sermons do not prepare you for it. The wall is larger than the imagination expects. The stones are more ancient and more massive and more real than any image has conveyed, and round it, always, is the living reality of worship and prayer and longing that has continued without pause for generation after generation after generation. The wall does not feel like a monument. It does not feel like a tourist attraction or a historical site. It feels alive. It feels, in some way that defies rational explanation, as though it is listening. Pastor David stopped walking when he saw it. He stopped and stood completely still, and the other pilgrims gathered around him, and they all stopped together. No one reached for their phone. No one spoke. Pastor David's chin trembled once, and then he pressed his lips together hard and breathed in slowly through his nose and looked at the wall with eyes that were full and bright. Sarah's hands came up to cover her mouth. Both hands. Her blue eyes were wide and filled immediately with tears she had not anticipated and could not have explained if asked. She had told herself on the flight over that she was approaching this trip as an open-minded investigation, a seeker but a rational one. Someone who would observe and consider and perhaps find some clarity. She had not planned to cry at the first sight of the wall. and yet here were the tears, warm and completely genuine, saying something that her carefully organized rational mind had not yet caught up to. Thomas felt something he could not name. It moved through him quickly, like a current of air through a room when a window is open. He did not cry. He did not reach out to anyone, but the folded arms posture he had carried since the airport was gone. His hands were at his sides and his face was open and unguarded in a way that was new, at least on this trip, at least in the presence of others. Mary was weeping, openly, quietly, without any self-consciousness whatsoever. The tears ran down the deep lines of her face, and she did not lift a hand to stop them. 47 years. The photograph above the kitchen sink. Every morning prayer. Every Good Friday. Every whispered petition sent in the direction of a city she had never seen. And now she was here. She was here, and it was real, and the wool was real, and God was real, and everything she had believed in and held onto through all the long years of her life was real. She wept with the completeness of someone who has waited a very long time for something and has finally arrived. Rabbi Moshe had been coming to this wall every day for 40 years. He had prayed here in every season and every weather. He had stood here in grief and in joy and in the ordinary dailiness of a life devoted to faith. He was a tall man, slightly stooped by age, with a white beard that caught the sunlight and eyes that held in them a particular quality of wisdom that comes only from long and serious living. He stood near the wall with his hands clasped behind his back, and he watched the Christian pilgrims arrive as he had watched thousands of pilgrims arrive before them. With a calm and generous attention, Pastor David approached Rabbi Moshe with the careful respect one man of faith instinctively extends to another. He introduced himself simply, just his name and where he was from. Rabbi Moshe extended his hand and the two men shook hands and looked at each other with the particular recognition that sometimes passes between strangers who share, beneath all their differences, the same fundamental orientation toward the sacred. They spoke for a long time. Rabbi Moshe explained the history of the wool in the unhurried manner of a man who has told the story many times but who still finds it worth telling. He explained that the western wall is the last remaining retaining wall of the Second Temple complex, the temple that Herod the Great expanded and that the Romans destroyed in the year 70. He explained that for Jewish people the wall represents the closest accessible point to the Holy of Holies, the innermost sacred chamber of the temple where the presence of God was believed to dwell. He spoke about the 2,000 years of Jewish prayers directed toward this wall, of the tradition of placing written prayers in its cracks, of the Shabbat celebrations that transformed the plaza each Friday evening into something that felt, he said quietly, like a foretaste of heaven. Pastor David listened with his notebook open in one hand and his pen moving steadily. The other pilgrims gathered around and listened too. Sarah was writing rapidly. Thomas stood at the edge of the group with his arms loosely at his sides and his head tilted slightly, the posture of someone genuinely hearing something for the first time. Rabbi Moshe paused in his explanation and looked at the group with a gentle expression. He said that many Christians came to this wall and he always found it moving to watch them. He said that for Jewish people the wall represented exile and longing and the hope of restoration. And yet, he said, it also represented the unbroken thread of a covenant between God and humanity that ran through history like a golden line. And that thread connected people across traditions in ways that were mysterious and beautiful and perhaps, he suggested, intentional. Thomas raised his hand slightly, hesitantly, as if he was not entirely sure he had the right to ask. He asked Rabbi Moshe whether he thought it was possible to stand at this wall and find faith when you had lost it, or perhaps when you had never quite had it in the first place. Rabbi Moshe was quiet for a moment. Then he said that in his experience the wall did not manufacture faith, but it did, he said, create the conditions in which faith could breathe. It was a place, he said, where the noise of ordinary life became quiet enough that a person could hear what had always been there beneath it. Thomas nodded slowly and said nothing more, but something in his posture changed again. The last of the guardedness went out of it. Pastor David walked toward the wall alone. The plaza was busy with worshippers and tourists, but he moved through the crowd with a kind of quiet intentionality that created its own space around him. He approached the men's section of the wall and he stood before it and looked up. The stones rose above him in courses of enormous limestone blocks, each one ancient and massive and fitted together with a precision that 2,000 years had not disturbed. He raised his hand and placed his palm flat against the stone. The stone was cool. It was rough and real beneath his hand. And Pastor David, a man who had preached about this wall and taught about this wall and dreamed about this wall for 30 years, stood with his hand against it and felt something leave him. Something he had been carrying for a long time without quite knowing he was carrying it. Some accumulated weight of doubt and weariness and the particular spiritual exhaustion that comes from years of tending to the faith of others while quietly neglecting to tend to your own. He felt it loosen and begin to lift. He pressed his forehead against the stone. His lips moved. He did not speak aloud. The prayer he prayed in that moment was between himself and God, and it needed no witnesses. Sarah made her way to the women's section of the wall. She stood in line behind other women, some Jewish, some Christian, some whose faith tradition she could not identify. When it was her turn, she approached the wall and stood before it and felt suddenly very small and very young and very uncertain of what to do with herself. She placed both hands flat against the stone. She looked at the ancient surface before her, at the thousands of prayer notes stuffed into every available crack, the accumulated paper prayers of millions of people across the centuries, each one representing a human heart that had stood exactly where she was standing and reached out towards something beyond itself. She had written a prayer note on the plane. She had folded it carefully and kept it in the small pocket of her dress. She reached for it now. She pressed it into a crack in the stone and held her fingers there for a moment after releasing it. And then, without quite deciding to, she began to pray, not in the formal language of Sunday morning services, not in the practice phrases of the prayers she had memorized as a child. She prayed in the raw and polished language of a person who is not sure they are being heard but who needs to speak anyway. She prayed for the faith she had lost and the faith she was looking for and the faith she was not sure she deserved. She prayed until the tears came, and then she prayed through the tears, and when she finally lifted her forehead from the stone, she felt emptied in the best possible way, as though something had been washed clean inside her. Thomas stood a few feet behind the boundary of the prayer area and watched the others. He watched Pastor David at the wall. He watched Sarah. He watched the Jewish men swaying in prayer, their bodies rocking forward and back in the ancient rhythmic posture of davening, their voices joining the low continuous murmur that hung over the wall like a living thing. He watched an elderly Jewish man press his lips against a stone, and then stand back and look at the wall with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated devotion that something caught in Thomas's chest. He took a step forward, then another, and then he was walking toward the wall with a directness that surprised him because he had not consciously decided to do it. He reached the wall. He stood before the ancient stones. He lifted his right hand and placed it against the surface. The stone was cool and solid and undeniably, irrefutably real, and Thomas, who had spent so long in the cold country of doubt, stood at the western wall and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, warm. He did not cry. He did not kneel. He did not perform any gesture of dramatic spiritual transformation. He simply stood with his hand on the stone and his eyes closed, and he was quiet inside in a way that he had not been quiet inside for years. The silver cross at his throat caught a ray of afternoon sun, and he felt the small familiar weight of it against his chest, and for the first time it felt less like a memory and more like a declaration. Mary reached the women's section of the wall with Thomas's help, his steady arm guiding her through the crowd. He settled her gently before the ancient stones and then stepped back to give her space. Mary lifted both hands and placed them flat on the wall. Her hands were small and lined and spotted with age. They shook slightly with the tremor that had come with her 70s, and they pressed against the ancient stone with a steadiness and a certainty that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the soul. She prayed for her children and her grandchildren and the great-grandchild who had just learned to walk. She prayed for her late husband, the man she had loved for 51 years and buried 3 years ago. She prayed for the world in its current state of confusion and weariness. She prayed with the full accumulated weight of a long life of faith, a faith that had been tested by grief and illness and loss, the ordinary relentless difficulty of being human, and that had survived every test and emerged each time a little stronger and a little more refined and a little more genuinely hers. When she finally lifted her hands from the wall, she turned and found Thomas standing behind her, watching. His expression was unguarded and his eyes were wet. He said nothing. He simply offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked back through the plaza together in a silence that felt full rather than empty. The evening came over Jerusalem with a particular softness that seemed to belong only to the city. The light turned from gold to ember to the deep warm purple of approaching night, and the stones of the old city held the warmth of the day and released it slowly, reluctantly, the way a person releases something beloved. The western wall plaza filled with the electric light of the lamp standards and the candlelight of the Shabbat preparations, and the wall itself seemed to glow from within, as though the centuries of prayers absorbed into its stones were giving off a gentle light of their own. The pilgrim group sat together on stone benches in the plaza facing the wall. No one was speaking. They had moved past the need for words for the moment. Pastor David had his journal open in his lap, but his pen was still. He was simply looking at the wall with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been traveling toward his whole life and who is not ready to look away. Sarah sat beside him with her notebook closed against her chest, her eyes moving over the wall and the worshippers and the plaza and the dark sky beginning to show the first few stars above the ancient stones. She was not thinking in her usual organized and analytical way. She was simply present, simply here, simply open, and the question mark that had followed her faith for so many years felt, if not entirely gone, then at least quieter, less urgent, as though the wall itself had said without words that it was acceptable to not know everything. That arriving with questions was not the same as arriving empty. Thomas sat at a slight distance from the others, not with the separateness of earlier that day but with the separateness of a person who needs a little space to hold something new and fragile and not quite fully understood. He had his hand around the silver cross at his neck, not gripping it, just holding it. His eyes were on the wall and his face was peaceful in a way that was new. That night the group ate together in a small restaurant in the Christian Quarter, a low-ceiling room with stone walls and wooden tables and the warm smell of bread baking. They talked quietly and ate bread and hummus and olives and roasted lamb and drank thick dark coffee. They talked about what they had seen and felt, and they talked with the openness that sometimes becomes possible between people who have shared something significant together. Thomas spoke more than he had spoken at any point in the journey so far. He did not make any grand declarations. He did not announce a conversion or a revelation. He simply spoke honestly about what he had felt standing at the wall, and the others listened and did not press him for more than he had to give. Mary told a story about the photograph she had cut from a magazine in 1978 and kept above her kitchen sink for all these years. Everyone around the table was quiet as she told it. When she finished, there was a moment of silence that was not awkward but companionable. The silence of people who have just heard something true. The next morning the group rose early and walked through the still sleeping streets of the old city to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The church was built on the site that tradition and significant historical evidence identifies as the location of the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. It is a massive and ancient building, dark and labyrinthine within, smelling of incense and candle wax and the accumulated devotion of 17 centuries of continuous Christian worship. It is not a beautiful building in any simple or obvious sense. It is complex and layered and sometimes overwhelming, but it is, for the Christian pilgrim, something that transcends beauty entirely. They entered through the great wooden doors in the early morning, when the church was not yet crowded and the candlelight was the primary light and the incense. Smoke moved in slow columns toward the high ceiling. They stepped over the threshold and stood in the low entrance area, where the stone of anointing lay on the floor before them, a flat slab of pink limestone on which tradition holds that the body of Jesus was prepared for burial. The stone was worn smooth by centuries of hands and lips and tears. Flowers and oil lamps were ranged around it and candles burned at its corners. Sarah knelt at the stone without hesitation. She pressed both hands flat on its surface and bent her head. Her long brown hair fell forward round her face. She stayed there for a long time, longer than she had planned, longer than was strictly comfortable on the hard stone floor. When she finally rose, her face was wet and completely at peace. The expression of someone who has just set down something very heavy that they have been carrying for a very long time. They made their way deeper into the church, through corridors and chapels belonging to different Christian denominations, Orthodox and Catholic and Armenian and Coptic and Ethiopian, each community maintaining its own corner of this shared sacred space in a complex arrangement centuries old. Candles burned in every direction. Icons gleamed from dark walls. The low sound of chanting came from somewhere above them. Greek Orthodox monks beginning the morning liturgy, the ancient words filling the stone space like water filling a vessel. They reached the edicule, the small stone chapel that marks the site of the tomb. A line of pilgrims wound through the interior of the church toward its narrow entrance. They joined the line and moved forward slowly. The atmosphere within the church had shifted as more pilgrims arrived, and there was now a low continuous murmur of many languages. Prayers spoken in English and Spanish and American Greek and Korean and Portuguese. A Pentecostal petition rising through the incense smoke toward the dome above. Pastor David was the first of the group to enter the edicule. He bent low through the small doorway and disappeared inside. He was in there for several minutes. When he emerged, his face was simply extraordinary. There is no more precise word for it. It was a face that had been somewhere most faces never go and had come back changed. He stood to the side as the others went in, and he pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Thomas was last. He stood outside the edicule entrance for a long moment looking at the low doorway. The doorway was barely large enough to enter upright. A person had to bow to enter it. Thomas looked at the doorway for a long moment and then he bent his head and went in. Inside the edicule there was almost no space. The ceiling was low and the walls were close and every surface was covered in gold and silver decoration, and the light came from oil lamps and candles hanging above the tombstone itself, a white marble slab covering the actual bedrock of the original tomb. Thomas knelt at the marble. He placed both hands on it, and in the small enclosed space, in the golden lamplight, alone with the thing that had brought him here from the far side of doubt, Thomas prayed for the first time in years with the complete and undefended honesty that real prayer requires. He did not ask for proof. He did not demand certainty. He asked simply to be held, to be known, to belong to something larger than his own confusion. And in the silence of the tomb, something that was not silence answered. When Thomas emerged from the edicule, he was not dramatic about it. He simply came out and stood blinking for a moment in the slightly brighter light of the main church interior, and then he found the group and stood with them, and that was all. But the change was visible to anyone who had watched him since the airport. He was present now in a way he had not been before. The distance was gone. They spent the rest of the morning in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, moving through its many chapels, sitting in corners to pray or simply to be still, allowing the weight and the beauty and the history of the place to settle into them at whatever depth it would reach. When they finally emerged into the bright Jerusalem noon, the sunlight felt almost startling, the way sunlight always feels when you have been somewhere dark and still for a long time. From the Church of the Holy Sepulchre they made their way to the Mount of Olives. The van took them around the outside of the old city walls and up the slope of the mount, and they emerged at the top, and the view of Jerusalem spread before them, and it was one of those views that makes a person understand why human beings have always sought high places for their most important conversations with God. The entire city lay below them, the ancient walls of the old city, the gleaming dome, the western wall invisible from here but felt, the dense layering of sacred history compressed into a few square miles of stone and earth and sky. Beyond the city the Judean wilderness stretched to the horizon in shades of brown and gold. The afternoon light fell across everything at a low angle that made the stones glow from within. They walked down through the ancient cemetery on the Mount of Olives, the oldest Jewish cemetery in the world, where the stone grave markers stretched in their thousands across the hillside. Then they entered the Garden of Gethsemane, where the ancient olive trees stood in their tremendous gnarled silence, trees that were already old when the Roman Empire fell, trees whose roots reached into soil that the feet of Jesus walked 2,000 years ago. The garden was quiet in a way that felt intentional. The ancient trees created a canopy of silver-green leaves through which the afternoon light filtered in moving patterns across the stone pots below. There was bird song and the faint sound of the city beyond the garden walls, and the particular quality of silence that exists between sounds. In a very old and very sacred place, Mary sat on a stone bench inside the garden and looked at the ancient olive trees with an expression of such complete peace that it seemed wrong to disturb her. Thomas sat on the earth itself, his back against the massive gnarled trunk of one of the ancient trees, his journal open in his lap, writing. Sarah walked slowly along the stone path between the trees, her hand trailing against the rough bark of each one as she passed, her lips moving in the private language of personal prayer. Pastor David stood in the center of the garden and looked round him and thought about a night 2,000 years ago when another man stood in this garden and prayed in the knowledge of what was coming and chose to go through with it anyway. The magnitude of that choice, considered here in the actual garden where it was made, was almost too large to hold in the mind. He simply stood and let it be large. They visited the Church of All Nations, built over the rock in Gethsemane where tradition locates the prayer of Jesus on the night before his death. The interior of the church was dim and gorgeous, its ceiling covered in deep blue mosaic that gave the space the quality of praying inside the night sky. The rock itself was low and rough and surrounded by a wrought iron railing shaped like a crown of thorns. Pilgrims knelt at the railing and pressed their hands through it to touch the stone. When it was Pastor David's turn, he knelt and reached through the railing and placed both hands on the rock, and he thought about all the things he had prayed about in his 30 years of ministry, all the times he had told his congregation to trust God in difficulty, all the times he had preached about surrender and sacrifice and faith in the face of the unknown. He thought about all of that, and he prayed now with the depth of understanding he had not possessed before he came to Jerusalem, and he was grateful, more grateful than he had words to express, that he had finally come. That evening they returned to the western wall. The plaza was different in the evening light, warmer and more intimate, and the approach of Shabbat was beginning to be felt. White-clothed worshippers were gathering in increasing numbers. Families were arriving with children. The atmosphere was shifting from the busy daytime activity to something more anticipatory, more ceremonial, more charged. The Shabbat preparations at the western wall are among the most moving things a visitor to Jerusalem can witness. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the men in the plaza began to sing. The singing started quietly, a few voices here and there, and then grew as more voices joined it. A deep rolling wave of Hebrew song that rose from the plaza and seemed to fill the space between the earth and the sky. The songs were ancient and joyful, and they spoke, even to those who did not understand a word of Hebrew, of gratitude and celebration and the profound gladness of being alive and being a people with a covenant and a God in a holy day. The pilgrim group stood at the edge of the plaza and listened. Sarah's hand found its way to her heart. Thomas stood completely still with his eyes moving from the wall to the singers to the darkening sky above and back again. Mary lifted her face upward as though the music were rainfall and she were receiving it. Pastor David pulled out his small notebook and wrote in it with rapid strokes, wanting to capture something before it faded. Though he knew that certain things cannot be captured and must simply be lived, the sun set. The first stars appeared. Shabbat had begun, and the Western Wall Plaza was transformed into something that defied easy categorization, something between a party and a prayer, between a concert and a liturgy, a living demonstration of a faith that had survived everything the world had thrown at it for 5,000 years and was still here, still singing, still celebrating, still pressing forward and backward in the ancient rhythm of devotion before the ancient stones. Later that night, after the group had eaten and returned to the guest house, Thomas sat at the small wooden desk in his room and opened his journal and began to write. He wrote for a long time. He wrote about the airport and the van and the Jaffa Gate, and the Via Dolorosa, and the Western Wall and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Edicule in Gethsemane and the Shabbat singing. He wrote about what he had felt at each of these places, honestly and without the ironic distance that had been his habitual protection against feeling too much. He wrote about the silver cross at his throat and what it had meant to him as a memory and what it was beginning to mean to him now as something else. He wrote until his hand ached and then he put down the pen and sat back and looked at the ceiling of the small stone room and was at peace. The final morning in Jerusalem arrived with a clarity of light that seemed particular to the city, a sharp golden morning light that cut across the rooftops and illuminated the dust motes in the air and made everything look simultaneously very ordinary and very precious. The group gathered on the roof of the guest house as the sun rose and they stood together looking out over the old city, the 7 of them, and the city spread before them in the morning gold, the wall somewhere below and beyond the rooftops. Always there, always present, always listening. They walked through the streets of the old city one final time. They moved slowly, all of them, with the particular slowness of people who know they are leaving something and are trying to absorb as much of it as possible into themselves before they go. The streets were familiar now in a way they had not been for days ago. The stones underfoot were familiar. The smell of the air was familiar. The quality of light between the high stone walls was familiar. It felt, as places sometimes do when you have lived inside them even briefly, a little like leaving home. They came to the Western Wall for the last time. The morning crowd was not yet large and the plaza had the quiet quality of early hours. A few devoted worshippers already at the wall, the stones catching the low morning sun and turning a deep warm ember. The group spread out across the plaza and each person found their own final moment with the wall in their own way. Pastor David placed his worn leather Bible against the stones for a moment, the spine of it touching the ancient surface. And then he held it to his chest and closed his eyes and said, "Goodbye," in the way that people say goodbye to places they know they will carry with them forever. Sarah pressed her hand against the wall one last time and looked at all the prayer notes filling the cracks, and thought about her own note somewhere in there, her own small piece of paper carrying her own private words, staying here after she left, remaining at the wall with the prayers of all the others, a thread of connection she would carry with her through whatever came next. Thomas pressed his forehead against the stone. He stayed that way for a long moment. When he stood up straight again, the silver cross caught the morning sun and he tucked it inside his shirt, closer to his heart, and turned away from the wall, with the expression of a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for and who intends to keep it. Mary stood before the wall with Thomas's arm around her shoulders and she lifted her face and looked at the stones rising above her and she said something, just a few words.